Okay, well, here we are. Welcome to Breaking Convention.
Thanks very much, Anna, and thanks very much, everybody, for coming. As you all will have heard by now, when the conference was first mooted, it was, I think, expected to be a much smaller affair, much smaller setting, and one where I was under the impression we would be talking not so much about work that had been completed, but work that was ongoing, almost like a research workshop. And it's in this spirit that I want to present some sort of notes from an ongoing research program, and also in an interactive way invite you to make some suggestions, because what I'm trying to do really is recruit you as research informants on this particular issue that I'll be talking about, which is polydrug use or polysubstance use. And it really relates to a couple of ongoing themes that have really sort of been running through the whole conference. And the first one is the importance of language, of terminology, of what do we actually mean by things. We talked yesterday about what does it mean with the term psychedelic and so on. We had various suggestions to lead the discussion forward. It is also important in the sort of sense that what somebody mentioned yesterday, the social constructionism, that certain terms and certain notions are construed in a social and political process. And often you have these alliances between professionals in different areas of work, researchers, including ourselves, and policymakers to identify certain areas of work and to create phenomena which perhaps sort of ex nihilo weren't really, they do not refer to an actual reality in the external world. The other thing, I think, is the context of legality or illegality of a lot of drug use, and that intrusion or the domination of the state, and how that impacts on the way that drugs are used and the sort of the social dynamics amongst drug users. And the very reason that I'm talking about polydrug use is because I was invited to attend a polydrug use working group of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, which is, of course, a body that's designed to inform policy making on issues. So when coming to this, I thought there is a number of things that need to be thought about. First, how did we get there to this term of polydrug use? And it is used now in policy and across different professional areas with a certain confidence, as if there's a really a concrete reality that's being denoted by the use of this term. And particularly when it comes to the drug treatment sector, the term is used to highlight a particular complexity of clients that even in this very difficult area of drug treatment are even more difficult to work with because their condition is not one that we've normally come across, but one of polydrug use. And then, interestingly and implicitly, it establishes this idea of monodrug use as a norm, as if monodrug use is something that is what we normally engage as, and polydrug use is a special condition that has to be engaged as. So I thought there were sort of three different dimensions which are of interest. One is the genealogy and the history of the term, a sort of Foucauldian sense, where how did we get there, how did we arrive and formulate this idea? The second, which is not really my bag at all, is a sort of a medical concern, which I suppose is of importance to people in A&E departments or in the drug treatment sector, i.e. how do different substances combine, how do different drugs work in the human body, and what do practitioners have to know if they're working with them in a clinical context. And then the third thing, which I think is even more interesting, is the sort of the social policy dimensions. Why are certain combinations of drugs, and why are certain drugs popular with certain groups, and with whom, and why, and what are the associations and the preferences? And this is an area where people in the audience know more about this than I do, and I'd really welcome some feedback afterwards. And I put my email details up because I'd like to get more information and suggestions. So I'm just sort of opening it. And I think it starts off in the genealogy and the history with a couple of fundamental, I won't say problems, but the history is marked. But first of all, by this sort of equivalence we've arrived at between the term of drugs and illicit drugs. Whereas, of course, there was a time when drugs denoted all forms of medicines, particularly in the 19th century, and most of these medications would have been compounds. And interestingly, the most effective ones, as some of our leading historians like Mike Jay have reminded us, one of the the leading, most effective compounds, medicines, were ones that combined ethanol, alcohol, with opium in a substance called laudanum, which was the mainstay of the medical profession for centuries. So there's a history of poly-drug use in medicine that well precedes us in, where we are today in this sort of criminalized world of drug use, which is not recognized as having any therapeutic value. But the confusion also extends even to the more scientific arms of government, where we are trying to collect information, like through the British Crime Survey, which asks on a regular basis about drug use in its household surveys. And it does collect information on polydrug use. So but if you combine two illicit substances like cocaine and cannabis, that will count for polydrug use. But if you combine, say, cannabis and alcohol, it doesn't. But more interestingly and suggestive of how uncertain people are about this is, for instance, the inclusion now of khat. The information is collected on khat use. Khat is, for those of you who don't know, a illicit substance imported into this country as a vegetable. And nevertheless, if you report khat use, then together with cannabis use, it would be considered and classified as polysubstance use. So the confusion is all around about what it actually denotes. Now, how it really arrived in the discourse, I'm not sure, but what I've sort of learned so far and what my feeling is that it's very much related to the consolidation of the drug treatment sector as a profession, as a field of practice in the 1980s and 90s, with its own rules and regulations, its own practical ethos, and then with the emergence of harm reduction, an ideology and a moral frame of reference that made it quite different and allowed it to distinguish itself from medical mainstream. And within harm reduction, very often the discussion moves from sort of abstract concepts, i.e. living with drugs, addressing the problems of drug use rather than addressing drug use itself, or correcting the harms that have been created by prohibition. It moves from these very often to the concrete manifestations of harm reduction, and you're down to a number of what are basically practices, the exchange of needles, the provision of condoms, pill testing, drug consumption rooms, and of course methadone maintenance. And methadone maintenance very often has become almost like a fetish across the world. To establish methadone as a medicine is regarded very much as a triumph for the harm reduction movement. It's now in the list of essential medicine by the WHO. And we go to many different countries, and one of the key sort of things is to establish that methadone is a medication that should be available for problem drug users. And it all has its benefits, I believe, for certain forms of people with opiate problems, with problems with an opiate, who have a problematic relationship with their opiate use. And for a couple of decades, that was the principal client cohort that drug treatment services in this country had to deal with, and much of Europe. But in the 80s and 90s, there was a shift with the arrival of cheap, widely available, and affordable cocaine and coca products. Suddenly you have new cohorts of drug users who report problematic patterns of use with both heroin and cocaine, and often with combinations like speedballing, taking them together, which made it difficult for drug treatment workers to find an adequate way of dealing with them. And again, within the treatment field, there is this ongoing discussion about what do you want to do with your people? Do you want to get them into abstinence, or do you want to maintain them? Regardless of that, methadone seems to be very effective of keeping people, maintaining them, making them come back to get their methadone prescription. Now, with cocaine clients, that does not seem to be the case. Most cocaine clients are what the drug treatment field calls chaotic. They don't keep their appointments. They don't come back. And I think from there you have this idea that we've got this new difficult client group. Why they're difficult? They use different drugs at the same time. That doesn't sound so good. Let's give it a more medical term. Let's call it a Greek prefix. It's a polydrug user. Then if we move from drug to substance, it's even more remote. And we've got a new phenomena, the polysubstance user, who is a novel problem that requires a novel approach. And of course, novel funding, usually, implicitly. And my sort of take on that is we got to step back and we've got to look at the way that substances are used. And that substances, in my opinion, have always been combined. And that, in fact, of focusing on the difficulty or the harm of polysubstance use, we should look at it in a different way. Because whenever psychoactive substances are taken, they're taken in combinations. And some of these combinations are deeply entrenched in different cultures. In our own culture here, the combination of ethanol and tobacco, for instance, is standard practice. But I think we find that if you go through the ethnographic literature, much talk was made yesterday about yaye. Yaye itself or yaye and ayahuasca are themselves combinations of different psychoactive plants, but they're often taken in combination with coca and tobacco, and often in conscious opposition to the consumption of food, nutrition, of course. So throughout there is this combination of different substances. This is the sort of the norm, the overriding norm, and it is in fact when people are obsessed with a single substance that I think the alarms should go on, and in a way that the Alcoholics Anonymous has, in its sort of totemistic approach to identifying what the problem with drugs is. It's a personal relationship between an individual and a particular substance that is problematic. It has sort of identified and outlined that. And you often hear it in the self-representations of problematic users, that they will say, I take this substance and that is my problem. Or that they delineate boundaries between themselves and others, perhaps more stigmatized users. Yeah, I drink, but I don't take heroin or something. So the sort of construction of identity sort of comes into it as well. And these are people for whom the suggestion that polysubstance use is a problematic would perhaps be welcome because it feeds into their own sort of sense of identification. Why certain substances come into being, into popularity, to me, I think is always an interesting one. And if we look back at some of our most popular and perhaps least recognized substance combinations, particularly ones that what are now called the soft drugs, the stimulant drugs, like caffeine used in combination with sugar and, of course, tobacco again, and how that coincides with the sort of the Enlightenment, the beginning of European or imperialism, the discovery of other countries, other cultures, taking back certain substances, but how also it fits into the mind frame of the Enlightenment, how at the early age of industrialization and economic expansion, cups that cheer rather than intoxicate, how it fits in with the work ethic, that I think is quite interesting. And I think it's in the same light that perhaps the global spread of cannabis over the past 50, perhaps 70 years, or we could perhaps track it back to the migration of Indian laborers in the 1830s and 40s who were taking the seeds to the New World, but also to Europe and so on. But the sudden globalization of cannabis is really quite fascinating because there's obviously a global requirement or global appreciation for the effects it has. And maybe it has something to do with modern, contemporary, postmodern work-life rhythms and how it slots in. And this is equally the case, I suppose, to the shifts that cultures undergo when, for instance, in countries like China or Cambodia or Laos, which are traditionally opium using, now the main opium which makes you sedate and dreamy and introspective, and how the trend now is towards amphetamine-type stimulants that sort of are more aligned with a work ethos in these industrializing tiger economies. I think they're real important cultural parallels. But in the UK, and this is what the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs is concerned with, the combinations that are sort of, there's a whole range of them, but people like Fiona Mission often talk about the connoisseurship that sort of many drug users, because they're so experienced in moving to the second generation, so they're much more in control, perhaps, of the states that they're trying to affect. And I've been trying to work on a classification of why people combine combinations, and this is where I would like to get feedback from you. The first one would be the maximization of effect, as in the aforementioned combination of cocaine and heroin. People are trying to maximize it, and of course there are different techniques. The injection of substances in itself, or smoking, would be ways of maximizing, trying to maximum stimulus. The second one is one we're all familiar with: the stretching, making your drugs, your precious drugs, go further. And it has an old tradition in this country. Watering down of beer so used to be standard practice. Now we mix cannabis with nicotine for reasons that are really determined by price rather than anything else. And then there's, of course, the more sophisticated sequencing of combinations in order to manage the drug effects and maybe alleviate, ameliorate the come down and so on. And now I would like to really move over to the audience and ask if you have any more suggestions, either for the classificatory schemes, but also if you know from people you know of combining drugs, different drugs combinations, and the rationale, the reasoning that's given for it, then I would be really grateful if you could email them to me. Thank you very much.